All right, it is now my privilege to bring to you Mr. Carsten Casteneda and his paper, The Pragmatic Prince.
Niccolo Machiavelli writes in The Prince, "It must be considered that there is nothing more difficult to carry out, nor more doubtful of success, nor more dangerous to handle than to initiate a new order of things. Indeed, the task of creating and governing a new society is daunting, if not near impossible. Machiavelli outlines the way that the prince, the ruler of the nation, can gain and keep power while ruling effectively. In order to do this, the prince must strip away pretenses of morals and goodness to make clear, cold decisions." Written in 1532, The Prince is still as relevant today in the time of COVID-19 as it is the day it was published, if not more so. Machiavelli's ideas revolve around decisions and disregard of moral limits. Because of this, Machiavelli's principles are commonly implemented by governments in a time of emergency, when decisions and actions must be made quickly, even if they violate civil liberties, democracy, and economic well-being. Indeed, almost every modern government relies on Machiavellian principles to some degree during times of crisis. In order for the prince to be an effective ruler, he must use any means to further his agenda and achieve his goals. To Machiavelli, the prince must work to obtain and keep power, and this can only be achieved through control of the citizens. In order to gain complete control of the citizens, the prince can use any means necessary, moral or immoral. If the prince must use violence, brutality, and deceit to gain control of citizens, it is justified in Machiavelli's eyes. Machiavelli writes that people should either be caressed or crushed. If you do them minor damage, they will get their revenge, but if you cripple them, there is nothing they can do. If you need to injure someone, do it in a way that you do not have to fear their vengeance. The prince must use all tools at his disposal to control political power and the citizens. Machiavelli outlines tactics that the prince can use to gain power and keep power. The forefront tactic is deceit. Machiavelli writes, "Never attempt to win by force what can be won by deception." The prince can use deceit to control those around him and obtain what he desires. An effective prince is one that can manipulate and deceive those that stand in his way, and it's through those tactics that the prince can gain power. However, deception can also be used to keep power once it is obtained. Machiavelli states, "The lion cannot protect himself from traps, and the fox cannot defend himself from wolves. One must, therefore, be a fox to recognize traps, and a lion to frighten the wolves." The prince must be cunning and calculating to protect himself from political adversaries and recognize the correct actions to take, as well as the dangers that lurk in government. When the prince is surrounded by those that he has manipulated and has control over, he can protect his own interests while furthering his political campaign. All this is obtained by deceit. Along with deceit, Machiavelli advises the prince to use fear to control the political power in the country. Fear is to be used as a tool to control the citizens and those in power. Humans respond to fear, whether fear of harm or disaster, and this can be utilized by the prince to create a more stable power system in government. Machiavelli writes, "It's much safer to be feared than loved, because love is preserved by the link of obligation, which, owing to the baseness of men, is broken at every opportunity for their advantage. But fear preserves you by a dread of punishment which never fails." Fear can be relied on, for fear permeates even the most selfish desires of man. When a ruler is loved, his subjects obey his orders solely out of obligation and gratitude. However, man's nature is selfish, and he will forsake the gratitude owed to the ruler to further his own gain. In contrast, when faced with harm or death, men act with thought to survival, rather than their own gain. Fear is the ultimate distractor, and the prince may manipulate his subjects with fear. In the bleak, fear-driven society that can occur as a result of Machiavellian philosophy, the state of the people can be little more than a slave. When society is deceived, manipulated, and in a state of fear, the freedom and happiness of the population suffer greatly. Rousseau writes in the social contract that every man, having been born free and a master of himself, no one else may under any pretext whatever subject him without his consent. To assert that the son of a slave is born a slave is to assert that he is not born a man. Freedom is such a basic human right to take that to take that freedom away is to take away the citizen's humanity. The prince rules with impunity and cunning, and his manipulation strips the true freedom of the citizens. If the people of society live in fear of their ruler and are unable to make choices in the freedom they live in without their true human rights. In order for a society to be successful in times of peace and the citizens to be happy, they must live with freedom. Freedom, a necessary and inalienable right, should come as guaranteed in a healthy society. However, a society in which human rights are not respected and the freedoms of the citizens are disregarded has a tendency to dwindle into despondency. In the society of the prince, there lies the great possibility that the country will grow to hate the prince as a result of his cruelty and injustice. Machiavelli writes, "Therefore, the best fortress is to be found in the love of the people. For although you may have fortresses, they will not save you if you are hated by the people. If the citizens hate their ruler, no amount of love or fear will keep them in allegiance with the prince. Therefore, it is necessary that the prince is not hated. However, the policies advocated by Machiavelli and the cruelty of the philosophy has a tendency to cause the citizens to hate their leader when exercised in times of peace. The philosophy can backfire and will ultimately strip power from the ruler. By restricting the human rights of the citizens, the prince walks a delicate tightrope between fear and hate. When applied unconditionally and at all times, Machiavelli's principles create a tyrannical government that disregards the rights of the citizens. And this can result in an unstable society. The goal of the prince is to hold political power and control his subjects. In order to do this, he can use any means necessary. Murder, torture, deception, and manipulation are tools of the prince and can be used at his discretion. Morality is replaced with impunity, and the citizens will suffer as a direct result. In times of peace, the prince's actions can cause the citizens to develop hate for the prince. From this, it seems that Machiavelli's philosophy results in an immoral, broken governmental system. However, the key to the usefulness of Machiavelli's government lies in its conditionality. If the Machiavellian government is implemented all of the time, through times of war and in times of peace, it will eventually crumble. But when used conditionally, in times of emergency and turmoil only, the Machiavellian principles can be efficient. In times of peace, Machiavellian principles cannot be used because the citizens will grow unsatisfied and hateful with the prince, and they will desire to rebel. When a country is stable and citizens are happy, they think first of their own well-being, as they are not distracted. When the prince carries out his policies and they tend to infringe on the rights and conveniences of the citizens will realize that their best interests individually are not being served. Thus, out of the spirit of selfishness and self-preservation, the population as a whole will grow dissatisfied and revolt. Therefore, the prince cannot directly inhibit the selfish desires of the people, or he will ultimately be overthrown. A prince that is loved works to serve the citizens and cater to their selfish desires. Through policy and speeches, many rulers have gained themselves favor with their citizens. Oppositely, many rulers and dictators have lost their citizens' favor through harsh restrictions and unjust policies. In order to be an effective ruler, the prince must allow the citizens to believe they are being catered to, or else run the risk of the citizens hating. In order to understand when the Machiavellian principles will be effective and how the prince can rule, one must understand the impact of human nature on politics and governments. Humans' tendencies to do certain things, act in certain ways, and obey certain commands all stem from their base nature. Human nature as a whole leans with a tendency towards self, and an integral part of our human nature is the desire to do what's best for oneself. Selfishness has been prevalent since the first man, and it is understandable. In order to survive, humans must act with thought to what will benefit them and ultimately keep them alive. The desire to do what's best for oneself is part of human nature. In politics, human nature is especially prevalent and drives all political dealings and actions. A nation is made of people, and each of them is under the authority of the government. The government is a body set to govern the country and the people in the country. In short, a country is made up of humans governing other humans and advising on the affairs of humans. Also, human nature and the tendencies that come with it are applicable to all people. From this, it can be determined that human nature holds a large influence over the government. In order for a ruler to be effective, he must understand the tendencies of his subjects. When one can understand the human nature of those they govern and those around them, they can better make decisions that will be in the best interest of themselves and the people of society. People's drive for self-interest can be manipulated through times of emergency by the prince to maintain power. Machiavelli writes, "Men are driven by two principal impulses, either by love or by fear. Of these, fear is the most reliable, and the prince can rely on being feared to control the citizens. However, as we have already established, the prince is also prone to becoming hated, and this is not conducive to keeping power. In order for the prince to carry out the actions that he desires and keep complete control, he must subvert the human nature of the citizens, and the most effective way to do this is through distraction. Fear distracts humans from much of their selfishness, as a man that is faced with death as a punishment will most likely obey the law in place out of fear. However, the prince cannot use fear to its fullest potential, as he will run the risk of being hated. When a country is faced with an emergency, such as war, disease, or famine, the citizens fear the threat and will act out of fear. Emergency distracts the citizens from the actions of the prince. In a time of emergency, the ruler can act without fear of hatred, as the people's selfish nature has been redirected onto the emergency. No longer are the citizens unhappy with the prince's infringement on their rights, but they are unhappy with the emergency and are distracted from the doings of the prince. The prince can manipulate the emergency to gain the love and admiration of the people. Machiavelli writes, "Therefore, it is unnecessary for a prince to have all the good qualities I have enumerated, but it is very necessary to appear to have them. And I shall dare to say this also, that that to have them, and always to observe them, is injurious. And that to appear to have them is useful, to appear merciful, faithful, humane, religious, upright, and to be so, but with a mind so framed that you should require not to be so, you may be able to know how to change to the opposite. The prince must appear to be magnanimous, and he can accomplish this by using the emergency to distract and gain the favor of his people. A leader that can put up the appearance that he is guiding his country well through a time of distress is generally regarded highly and well liked. The prince can put up the appearance of mercy, humanity, and an interest in the public good, when in fact he's using the distraction to gain more power and control over his country. After the emergency, no matter the result, the prince will emerge more powerful as well as more highly regarded if he uses the distraction to manipulate his country. In a time of emergency, the prince can reach new heights of power and unite his country while gaining favor. This is incredibly advantageous to the prince, and he will profit greatly from his country's emergency. Because of the practical, efficient nature of Machiavelli's government, it can be well suited to times of crisis. In emergencies and crises, swift decision-making is imperative to effectively dealing with the situation. The Machiavellian government is ruled by the prince, and the prince holding great amounts of power and control over his country. Because of this, the prince can make decisions much faster than the government of a democracy. In times of war, a military-minded leader is much more effective in leading his country. With control over the people and power over his entire country, he can use his country's resources and armies to its best potential. In short, the Machiavellian government is useful in times of emergency when swift decision-making is necessary. Although the successful governments of the world are not true Machiavellian governments, in the sense that a single prince is in complete control and the citizens are subject to the manipulation of the prince, many modern governments apply principles of Machiavelli's philosophy. Also, the nature of governments to work to gain more power over their citizens while keeping up favorable appearances is directly Machiavellian. Indeed, Machiavelli's governmental philosophy is streamlined for efficiency and practicality. The principles of the prince are in place whether they're recognized or not. In a world where selfishness guides the actions of humans and leaders desire power and control, the government described in the prince is relevant. A modern example of Machiavellian governmental philosophy in the world is the COVID-19 pandemic and the reactions of the governments around the world. Faced with the threat of the virus, many have replaced their desires to go to work, socialize, and enjoy other activities because they're now faced with fear of infection. They have forsaken their selfishness for fear, and the governments have been able to use this to exercise more control over the citizens. the United States government and the individual state governments have issued orders for citizens to stay at home and shelter in place. Along with these orders, legislation has been passed to combat both the economic and humanitarian fallout to be expected. At first glance, this is a benevolent approach by the government and is to be praised and admired. These measures of social distancing and sheltering in place are touted as effective and necessary to combat the pandemic. The laws are proclaimed as just, and the orders are helpful in the attempt to stop the virus. However, they show Machiavellian ideals through their implementation. Throughout the United States, governors have taken it upon themselves to decide the regulations and procedures regarding COVID. They make quick, calculated decisions that they deem would aid the majority of the citizens. Although rights may have been infringed upon and manipulation was used, the actions of the government were beneficial to some extent to slowing the spread of the virus. Without Machiavellian decision-making and the ability to wield power in a way that directly controls the citizen, this would not have been possible. In this instance, the Machiavellian approach to this situation was used worldwide, with presidents and prime ministers revealing the princes underneath. Governors and members of the government wielded a great amount of power and put themselves in a position of power higher than that prior to the emergency of the pandemic in a Machiavellian display of government. In the end, Machiavelli's philosophy is based on efficiency and pragmatism. Decisions are made by the ruler in power, regardless of the beliefs or ideas of the citizens. Democratic discussions are replaced with decision-making in the name of speed, and in most cases, the voices of individual citizens can tend to be silenced. Machiavelli's ideas are useful on a conditional level. If Machiavellian principles are applied in a country during times of peace, the government will collapse. But if they're applied in times of emergency, they can be effective. A government in emergency needs swift decisions and a focused leader that can guide his country. However, the line must be drawn in the sand between quick decisions and dictatorship. It's clear that Machiavelli is alive and well in our world and our country. The question then arises, do we want a prince?
Thank you very much, Mr. Casteneda. I would like to begin by looking at the question of what situation is most advantageous to the prince. The way that you've laid it out makes it look like the situation that is really the easiest for the prince to rule is time of emergency. And usually you think of emergencies as being a bad thing, but if your ruler's Machiavellian enough, he may come to the conclusion that emergencies are a good thing, at least for him. Mm-hmm. Now, how could you argue with a ruler or try to persuade a ruler that creating emergencies to ensure his own security of rule is a bad thing to do?
Well, ultimately it boils down to a moral idea and discussion, because to continually subject your citizens to harm or emergency is immoral and unjust, and eventually, after a period of time, there will be a point where citizens become unhappy with it, and they will throw off the Machiavellian laws, because the Machiavellian way of government can only work for so much time until the citizens can see what's happening and will eventually revolt.
Well, it seemed, though, that the way you explain things in the paper, that when there's no emergency, that the citizens are most capricious because they're just attending to their own desires, and that a ruler almost needs emergency to create a situation in which people need rulers. They need guidance, and so emergency seems to be the more stable time. If a ruler could find a way to create emergencies and yet not have the people understand that these are him creating them, wouldn't that be the ideal situation for a ruler?
For the prince, it would be, because he would be able, if he was Machiavellian enough and brutal enough, he could use the emergencies to his disposal just to keep gaining more power. Mm-hmm. But hopefully the ruler is benevolent enough and not Machiavellian enough to make the right decisions for a good government.
Yeah, it seems like emergencies is kind of a modern form of the Gyges ring problem. If you remember in the Republic, Gaiji's ring, you put the ring on, it makes you invisible.
Mm-hmm.
And now you can do evil without repercussions. And with a ruler, if a ruler can create a continual state of emergency, the people are always just kind of in total need of him and not going to question him. They're just dying to get out of the emergencies. And yet the question the Republic Plato puts forward is, if you could put on Gaiji's ring, why would you continue to be just? And how would you argue with a ruler to say, no, don't go there. Don't put on the Gaiji's ring of emergency. Don't try to gin up people's dependency upon you by creating emergency or pretending a particular emergency or virus is more dangerous than it is, so that people keep gushing over you and wanting to give you all of their freedoms. What could you say to a ruler to say, don't go that way? Don't try to create a sense of emergency to ensure your own political stability.
I think I would probably say that it just can't work forever. We've seen in communist countries and countries with dictatorship that there's a point where people will know their rights, desire their rights, and see where their leader is manipulating them and where their leader went wrong. So it really can't last forever. There's only a certain amount of emergencies the ruler can use. And also, I'd probably try to talk to the moral side of the ruler, and that it can be easy to take morality away from politics. Like Machiavelli did it really well in his book, but in the real world, morality is part of all of us and has to play out in the politics.
Mm-hmm. Well, or coming from the other side, how do you think we can, you might say, order our own lives so we are not the sort of people that are almost eager for emergency, but the sort of people who would be quick to be the sort of people that are not given over just to submitting to emergency think. Not being the sort of people that when the ruler says, oh, there's a lion in the street, there's this big problem and I'm going to fix it for you and become dependent upon me. How could we structure ourselves to be the sort of citizens that would not be as inclined to give ourselves over to that?
I feel like critical thinking and a good knowledge of the ruler's intentions can help, because if you can understand the ruler and you can understand what they have to gain in any situation, then you can better look at the situation and decide what your course of action will be. It's really about understanding.
All right, thank you very much. All right, other questions for Mr. Casteneda?
Yes, Ben.
All right, so I like your paper.
Thank you.
Everyone always says that, but I actually do. So you said that the Machiavellian form of government cannot last very long because they'll eventually be discovered by the people and will be ousted from power. But to me, it seems like a lot of times in a democratic government or a more Republican government, any government that has a visage of individual control by the people, that Machiavellian government can be carried on for a lot longer amount of time if they keep an appearance of not actually controlling everything. So what are some ways that you can kind of keep the Machiavellian government on life support for a long period of time, even after, if it had just been a little more open about that, it would have been taken away?
Mm-hmm. Well, part of Machiavelli's favorite tactics are deceit and being able to portray yourself as a reflection of something better. So if the main ruler in power can do his work through other people and in a way kind of spread the blame out among members of his cabinet or his advisors or anything like that, that can be useful. And also if he can give gifts to the people, and in a way people tend to forget a lot of bad things if you give them things. And
Yeah.
so that would be pretty effective.
That's just saying it's a lot about just the perception that you create within people rather than what you're actually doing.
Exactly.
Yeah. Thank you.
First off, very interesting paper. It's a great discussion paper, and I really liked it. That makes it. So just to get at one of the hearts of the issue, I think, what would you say is the purpose of government?
I think the purpose of government is to create a happy, healthy society where the citizens can thrive and they can live with their liberties and ultimately live with the highest quality of life.
Okay. So would you say that the Machiavellian government would create that sort of society in an emergency?
In an emergency, I think it can give the appearances of creating a good government, but ultimately, it wouldn't create a good government because the people's interest wouldn't be at the front. The ruler would be the one making the decisions and gaining more power. So it wouldn't ultimately create a good government. Yes, Ken.
So, I also really liked your paper. But you were talking about how the Machiavellian, whatever, in times of emergency, it's very efficient and practical instead of going through all the other processes. What would you say would be a good balance between regular, democracy and all that versus more Machiavellian, where it's very efficient during times of emergency? You think we should have something, someone with emergency powers so that they can quickly get things done, or what are your thoughts on that?
I think there can be a balance. There can be a balance in times of emergency because if the country is subjected to an emergency so horrible that citizens are at a high risk, ultimately, in a good government, the benefit of the citizens has to come first. And if a leader, if a good, just leader that can make the right decisions is the one in power and can make those decisions quickly, which will ultimately save lives or help the citizens, that can be actually beneficial to a good government. But the human tendency to not act when perfect justice can prohibit that.
Thank you.
Yeah.
So do all emergencies require government intervention?
If it is a national emergency,
Like a war?
like a war or a siege or something along those lines, there's a point where the government has to get involved because the government's job is to aid the people. And if the people aren't powerful enough to aid themselves, then the government will have to step in and have to use the government's resources and power to create a better country. Because if we're in a war and we have to rely on citizens' militias, it wouldn't ultimately work as well as having a national army that's responsible for our security.
And
That would be
how would you advise the citizen to recognize when Machiavellian principles are being used in their government, and what would you say is the best response to that?
I feel like in order to recognize the Machiavellian government, the best way would be just to read Machiavelli and to understand the principles and understand the way the government is working and understand why they're doing that, because that will ultimately influence what they're going to do in the future. And in response, I feel like educating others or responding with your own presence in government to combat the Machiavellian government can be effective. Yeah.
So I think you can come up with examples of leaders that in the past have been Machiavellian.
Mm-hmm.
Do you have some examples of beloved American presidents who maybe exhibited moments of Machiavellian impulses?
Well, in the Civil War, Abraham Lincoln removed habeas corpus as a right from prisoners because in the time of war, in the time of emergency, it was deemed necessary and it had to happen during the Civil War. So in that way, it was a Machiavellian removal of rights from citizens and prisoners, but it was still effective and necessary at that time to help his country through the war. So I think that's an example.
I'd like to look at the, you might say, opposite example from what we've been looking at. You brought up the COVID-19 situation and the possibility of that being used as sort of a fictional emergency to gain power. And yet there could be the opposite thing that happens too. A ruler who wants to diminish an emergency and tries to minimize that in front of the people. And the example that came up in my mind was the 1918 epidemic, which was much more serious than the present COVID epidemic. However, we were in World War I, and the government didn't want people to panic over an outbreak of influenza. And so they had advertising campaigns trying to tell people that this is really not a big deal. But 1 out of every 100 Americans was dying, and it was really bad. And so under what circumstances do you think, as citizens, we need to be aware of rulers underdoing emergencies? Trying to tell us something is not an emergency. Is that something that we need to equally be aware of?
I think so, because ultimately the entire idea of a Machiavellian ruler is that he's there to control and manipulate. And whether that's over expressing an emergency or under expressing an emergency, it's the same idea of manipulation. So that has to be watched too, because it could be distracting you from the actual emergency and the actual problem at hand. Mm-hmm. So if a president or a ruler creates a problem of his or her own doing, and it's their fault, and they try to diminish it in order to keep good graces with the people and manipulate their citizens, that has to be looked at, because it's unjust and it's manipulation.
Mm-hmm. All right, thank you very much. Other questions?
Yes, Ben?
Okay, so, with the state of the American public right now, how sensitive do you think we are to powers being overtaken by the government in an emergency? For example, when this all happened, I don't think many of us, either left or right, were very aware to the idea that we could have our way of life just taken away from us for an emergency that's very, very much drummed up to create fear and give the government power. But do you think that after understanding this, I mean, this is a very Machiavellian moment, do you think after understanding this that the public would actually be able to see through that kind of thing more in the future, or do you think we just haven't learned anything?
Ideally we would come out of that wiser and more knowledgeable of our government, but I think history has a way of repeating itself, and that governments are very, very good at putting themselves in the good graces. And a president that can guide his country through an emergency almost always will emerge much more liked and respected than he was when he entered, unless he completely fumbles the emergency. So I feel like it's something that will continue to happen in the future, unfortunately. Yes?
How much of the aspect of human nature that says we enjoy an us and them, which Hitler used very well, how much do you think that plays a role in Machiavellian dictatorship being successful?
I think it contributes greatly because once the ruler can understand his citizens' nature, and in a way when the ruler can predict the responses and ideas of the citizens before the citizens even have them, he can make decisions that he'll be able to control the citizens and be able to keep power and gain power, because in a way he's controlling their ideas and their responses just by understanding their human nature. So I think it's pretty dangerous.
I'd like to look at a moment of hope in your paper that you gave. You were talking about the advantage to a ruler that creation of emergency gives, and yet you seem to also say that the use of emergency will eventually run a society down, and that the sort of a Machiavellian assertion of power by a ruler will eventually run a society down. You say, however, society in which human rights are not respected and the freedoms of the citizens are disregarded has a tendency to dwindle into despondency. Can you explain more? Why does a society dwindle into despondency when subjected to tyrannical overreach?
Because our human rights, our inalienable human rights that are part of us, just as our human nature is part of us, cannot be subjected to oppression for a certain amount of time. And eventually, as we've seen in many dictatorships and governments, the people grow unsatisfied. And whether that leads to a complete revolt, or it just leads to dissension among the country, leaving it open to attack or other detriments, it ultimately comes down to over time, human rights and human nature will be the most powerful and shaping aspect of the government. And governments and leaders can do a very good job at a balance of peace and gifts and emergency and gaining more and more power. But eventually, if the government gets greedy and they won't be able to maintain that balance and will ultimately crumble, like all great governments or any government.
Thank you very much. Other questions?
Jonathan?
So we as Americans, I have a thought, how willing do you think we are to give away what we call freedom? Because for instance, in Nazi Germany has brought up is they were willing to give up what they would call maybe their freedom because Adolf Hitler promised a better future, better tomorrow for Germany. So how willing do you think we currently as Americans are willing to give up our what we call our freedom to a Machiavellian type government?
I feel like if you asked anyone in America, the immediate response would be they're not ready to give up their freedom. They don't want to give up their freedom. But the government can manipulate them in a way that appears they're still gaining freedom. They still have their freedom. Hitler promised more freedom in the future and a better future while undermining them and turning the country into a war zone. And so if the government, it's all about government manipulation, and if they can keep up the appearances of freedom, then the citizens will most likely tend to go along with it. I think we've seen with this epidemic that our freedoms were cut very, very harshly and quickly, and for a good amount of time it appeared necessary, and it was useful to a point of stopping the virus, but ultimately it's become more and more clear that it was almost an overreaction and almost an infringement on the rights of Americans. And so over time, I feel like it can become more clear as citizens can realize what's actually happening. But in the moment, the government can wield a lot of power with their manipulation.
Other questions? Thank you very much, Mr. Casteneda.